Dark Souls is the Dark Souls of Dark Souls. Seriously, before this game existed, what was the standard everyone compared everything to? I'm guessing The Legend of Zelda, something like that. And as much of a meme as it is, you'll find it is actually quite difficult to have a serious discussion of game design and not mention Dark Souls. It's like a drinking game at this point. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because what I think the Souls series does, at least up till now, we're seeing here in Dark Souls, is that it creates a language for a lot of different concepts in game design. And it has this very low-key nature about everything. And you end up walking away from the game feeling like all of your criticisms or all the things you didn't think worked super well or more on you as a player rather than the game itself. And it's this form of Dark Souls exceptionalism that I think is very interesting to try to exactly pinpoint why that is. Definitely the production value of the game and its just amazing tone and atmosphere contributes, and the overall just level of quality of all of its elements together. But I think there's something a little bit more to it, which is that I think Dark Souls has established essentially a third space in game design. It's a rare meeting ground for lots of different players from lots of different genres, and it's one of the few ways that all the different tastes of gaming are somewhat able to communicate to one another using the same language. And what makes Dark Souls very unique is its informal nature. The fact that it doesn't place any emphasis on anything too heavily. That's where I think the magic happens in terms of getting this huge crossover audience. Because if you talk to a casual player who's coming into Souls, then Souls is like the most hardcore, insane thing they've ever played, right? Because it's suggesting a lot of concepts and ideas of hardcore classical design, like memorization, like punishment, like routing, all these things you have to think about in a more skill-intensive game. But what separates Dark Souls from something like an arcade beat-em-up or a shmup is that in a classic game, you just have to figure it out eventually. You just have to keep pounding your head against that wall until you get through it. But in Dark Souls, especially now that they have the more interconnected, open-ended style of level design, you can just find a workaround. There's always a way around these scenarios. And that is what I think allows it to accommodate lots of different players from lots of different areas. And if the game placed any sort of specific emphasis on any element of the game, then one branch of the audience would have some sort of dominant effect on the other branch. But as much as the action game players will attempt to, they cannot force the more RPG style Souls players to play the game by their metrics or their rules. And Souls itself has no comment or opinion on whether or not you beat the bosses just level 1 with a club or something, or whether you just instantly kill them with really overpowered weapons and all that. And that does create some compromises in the combat system and in the level design and enemy layouts, and we'll talk about that here coming up. But it also is certainly a key factor in its popularity, I believe. And there is a phenomenon with Dark Souls discussion that I've started to observe, where what you say about Dark Souls tends to say more about yourself than it does the game itself. You can actually get a good barometer of what a person's game design values are and what they think good game design is by how they react to Dark Souls, because the game just is sort of presenting this canvas with all these cool, exciting factors, and then just letting you sort through it and sort of creating your own interpretation of it. And so you'll have some guys that are just really into the lore and exploring and going around and finding the painted world, and that's like the coolest thing ever. And that is a high value aspect of Dark Souls design that they would say is like key to its appeal and key to what pulls them into the game. Whereas I, of course, come from a more action game, formal background. And so the linearity of Demon Souls, the pace, the parts of Demon Souls that can really checkmate your ass and just insist that you get good is a key draw for me. So Dark Souls takes a step back from that. And for some people, that's just great. That's amazing. And then for other players, it's like, oh, that feels like a compromise. And how Dark Souls gets away with this is it has a very strong grasp of the fundamentals of game design, and it strips a lot of its systems back to those fundamentals. And that is what makes these fusions of ideas able to happen, because it's not layering too many systems on top of each other and not giving them too much priority over one another. Ultimately, of course, I think the RPG stuff overwhelms the natural combat. I think that is just the nature of RPG systems. But unlike a lot of other action RPG attempts, like a Final Fantasy 16, for example, Souls maintains this balance for a lot longer, where you get through an entire playthrough of Dark Souls and you just have faith that everything is working how it's supposed to work. Everything has a purpose. Everything is balanced and makes sense. And really, I think it is only until you get to the very end and you get into specific sections of the design, like the fire area, where you start to see some of the seams, where you start to be like, wait a second here. But it takes a very long time. And for this review, for example, I beat the game the first time. That took me like 20 hours. Fired it back up. The second time took me 6.5 hours. The third time was like 4 hours, 21 minutes. The final time, 3 hours, 39 minutes. You can see as you start to understand the game and learn the game, you chop away at under-designed aspects of it, but it takes time to get there. And I think that is something that's really impressive, and why when you walk away from playing through Dark Souls the first time, you're like, boom, nailed it. I can't see anything going on here. It's only to like the fifth time where you're abusing Poise armor on the final boss and setting up really easy parries. You're like, maybe this was a little underdeveloped. Maybe this was a little not completely thought through. But I think that's why FromSoft have been so consistent about not adding things like an easy mode. I don't think they're necessarily the bastions of we need to make games as hardcore as possible, because if you're paying attention, if you're reading between the lines a little bit, FromSoft have a real subtle touch with these types of things. So they will help out the player, but they want to do it in an informal, indirect fashion. That is their approach. That is their design philosophy. Like, for example, in Demon's Souls, that bridge section where it just beats you down over the head, the dragon surprises you, you have to just really hard memo and commit it right out of the gates. That had a ton of backlash.
Boldly, I stepped out onto the battlements of the castle, whereupon I was immediately insta-killed by a fire-breathing dragon. Whoops, guess you'll have to wait till the next boss to come back to life again, smarmed the game as I entertained the thought of microwaving the disc and feeding the art book and soundtrack CD to next door's goat.
And so did FromSoft react in an obvious telegraphed way to this and make an easy mode or do that kind of thing? No, but if you pay attention to Dark Souls, sure, they've got the dragon, but they show you the dragon right ahead of schedule. Right as you're walking on the bridge, that dragon flies in front of you, hits the bridge. You have to be completely oblivious and stupid not to see it this time. I think this is like their response to all the critics from Demon's Souls. They're like, all right, here's the dragon right in front of you. You see it? Here it is. And so it is this kind of quiet attention to detail that separates FromSoft from its contemporaries and creates that crafted feel of Dark Souls when it's at its best. And so let's begin by discussing the new interconnected world of Dark Souls that it is famous for, and its shift away from the level-based structure of Demon's Souls. What's interesting is that when you first start playing that initial castle area, you can feel the Demon's Souls DNA there. You can feel it being a real direct follow-up to Demon's Souls, and it would be interesting to go back and see what players' reactions to Dark Souls were at that time, the people who had played Demon's Souls, because I bet as they were playing this castle area, they're like, oh yeah, this is just like Demon's Souls. It's a nice, constrained, small-scale area with enemies in the way and these little shortcuts, and I feel like this castle gives us a good glimpse of what a direct follow-up to Demon's Souls probably would have looked like and felt like, and it is a massive highlight for me. And I would say that as we go through Dark Souls and play all of its different areas, there's a trend that I've really noticed, which is that the game's level design shines the brightest when the areas are smaller, constrained, enemies are blocking your path forward, and you kind of are trying to find where to go. That's when this nonlinear structure of Dark Souls is at its strongest, because you need to kill enemies and clear the areas out for risk mitigation. Because one thing I did like about the shift in level design of Dark Souls is that the enemies are more aggressive about pursuing you across large spaces. And so what happens when you're initially playing the game and learning where everything is and trying to figure out where to go is you spend a lot of time fighting and killing enemies because you do not want to get pincered. You don't want to get in a corridor where you've got one guy blocking one end and you got another guy blocking the other end, and they come together and crush you. That makes for very tense, difficult combat encounters. And so you're playing more proactively during these phases and killing things off, especially early on when all of the souls from the enemies really matter and scale. And so it feels very worthwhile, and it feels like all of the systems of the game are in sync and in harmony and coming together, and it's great. And there's nothing better than a fresh Dark Souls save file, and I mean that without any hint of irony. My favorite part of Dark Souls, non-skippable tutorial aside, seriously, can't skip it FromSoft? Outside of the non-skippable tutorial, my favorite thing about Dark Souls is that initial save file, playing low-leveled against the enemies in the castle, and that whole sequence, that first hour of Souls is just great. And if the game continued with this level of focus and this level of constraint, yeah, I would be completely won over into this new paradigm of design. The problem is, though, is that as the game continues onward, especially on repeated playthroughs, when you start to know, all right, this is where I need to go, this is what I need to do, your relationship with the game's combat and with the enemy's design starts to shift, where because you can go essentially wherever you want to go, there's some parameters early on, but for the most part, you can sequence break and go all of these different places, and rooms have multiple entrances and exits. And so what happens is that as you get familiar with the game's system and you get familiar with the layout of the levels and the behavior of the enemies, combat and that side of Dark Souls starts to become secondary, and your primary focus becomes traversal and routing. And that's because there's just so much space in the game. It's so big. And then on top of that, because it's an interconnected 3D world, FromSoft cannot effectively constrain you as a player. It's actually really interesting in the certain cases where it takes it to extremes to constrain you, but then it also shows, okay, this is how extreme the level design needs to be. For example, in Sen's Fortress, there's lots of ideas of blocking your forward progression through that area, right? They've got the snake guy just standing on this little catwalk. They've placed all of these obstacles to slow you down, make you engage with the enemies and stuff like that. But even there, that guy standing on a walkway, when you first start playing, you fight him and kill him because, you know, he's in the way. But then as you get more familiar with Sen's Castle and you're going through it for the 8th time, you decide, I'll just block him. And even though it doesn't look like it, I can still just squeeze right by him. And it takes these extremes of these tiny little ledges in Anor Londo to get you to have to stop and fight things or deal with things. And we won't even bring up like ranged weapons and stuff like that. Just even on the basis of melee combat, the game just cannot force you to deal with most of its enemies once you know the enemy layouts. And so that's why when you look at my playthrough progression, it starts at 20 hours and ends at like
3 hours, 39 minutes.
It's not that I've just leveled up that much in terms of my skill in Souls and in combat. I think I improved a bit, but much more than that is I just started to know where to go, and I started to realize, oh, like 85% of these encounters, if not more, I just can skip and go by it. Now, this is something that comes up in 3D action games a lot. This is not just unique to Dark Souls, of course. You'll see this in Ninja Gaiden 2 to some degree, but the difference there, I would say, is that if you're running past enemies in something like a character action game, Ninja Gaiden, Devil May Cry, even if it's kind of an oversight that you're able to get through this, the game is formally telling you that you should be fighting these enemies with the style system, with the scoring system, with the ranking system. So the game is communicating to you, hey, it's intended that you fight these enemies, and that's part of the core design of the game. In Souls, going back to the point I made about the informal style of design, is it core to the game's design that you fight the enemies in FromSoft's opinion? There's like this Rashomon effect to this question, because based off of your perspective, you could say, oh yeah, that's really why I play Souls, like going around, exploring these areas, fighting things, collecting items. That's what I'm here for. That's what I'm all about. But as someone who is more of a goal-oriented player, someone who I value getting through the challenges that the developer lays out for me, I found that no. In fact, combat outside of the boss encounters is more of an obstacle that you deal with from time to time, but the primary routing and things that you do are all about just traversal, moving, especially because now the bonfires respawn the enemies mid-area. Remember, in Demon's Souls, there were the shortcuts, but there weren't checkpoints within the area, so if you went back and respawned the enemies, you just restarted the level. It was like a restart level button. But now, because the checkpoints are in middle of the areas and you're respawning enemies around you, it doesn't make sense to constantly fight your way through them. And so you just naturally start to walk past enemies, run past enemies. That's almost always the player behavior. I know I do it myself, but I've also noticed this watching other people play Souls in these types of games, is when you first encounter the area, you're fighting things, you're exploring, you're looking around, and then once you die, you just sprint back past everything and grab your souls again. And then you're like, wait a second, I could have just sprinted past everything in the first place. So this is something that was an element in Demon's Souls, but because there were not restarting checkpoints in middle of the areas like there are in Dark Souls, it felt less like a dynamic because you would just be restarting the level every single time. And so going back to the level design, this tension is at its strongest in these constrained, tight, well-designed corridors, those handcrafted little layouts. Like, for example, when you're in the basement and you have to fight the Capper Demon, I think it is, and the run up to that is just all of these guys blocking the way, and then the dogs. And yeah, that's a great example of, okay, this is something that is getting pushed, especially because after you fight and defeat the demon, all of the enemies come surging into the room and you have to fight them as well. So that felt like an area where FromSoft were really insisting, okay, no, fighting these enemies is what we want to see. But you'll notice how unusually aggressive the dogs and these types of enemies need to be in order to create this dynamic. Same thing in the catacombs with the skeletons. One reason why that level also stands out and has this real feel to it is the fact that these skeletons, even if you kill them, they just keep respawning and they swarm you and they trap you, and you can walk into an area in the catacombs and just be in a dead end and you see all these skeletons on the other side. You're like, oh no. And so these types of levels are what gives Souls its feel and its pulse. Even the infamous entrance to Blighttown, what's funny about that is, as much as it annoys players and as infamous as it is one of the better designed areas of the game in terms of pressuring you and making you engage with the enemies and making you engage with the level design. That's a real strong highlight of Souls style approach to level design, I think. But what ends up happening is that as the game proceeds, and I think honestly, because we have some developer interviews about this and stuff, as the team just starts to run out of time and resources, the levels start to become more barren and empty and open. Now I would say the ultimate killer of Dark Souls design is open spaces, because then it's just traversal and there's no hiding that fact. And as the game goes on, you'll start to notice that your relationship with the level design inverts as a player, where in your first playthrough and your initial stages playing and learning the game, you feel relieved by these big open spaces. You feel like, whew, finally I'm safe. But as you start to replay and get more familiar with Dark Souls and its layout and everything, that relationship inverts, where now, because traversing and moving around things becomes sort of the default action of what you're up to, that is the standard way you engage with the game. When you are pushed into these situations where you have to deal with enemies and you have to fight them, that's like a breath of fresh air now. You're like, oh, finally, I'm on this catwalk and having shit shot at me, or I have to parry guys or else fall off the side. It's like, ooh, I feel something right now. So that is interesting how that happens. And it's a little bit of a tragic moment when you realize, wait a second, so I don't need to ever go down into the depths? And the initial thought as a player is like, nice, finally, I don't have to deal with this stuff and learn it and memorize it and get knocked off of things and feel that pain and tension. But then in your third or fourth playthrough, you're kind of like, I sort of miss the depths. This is the double-edged nature of this open nonlinear structure. Speedrunners talk about this a lot when there's route changes, like when there was a big route change for Super Metroid, and a lot of the stuff in any percent that they learned and all the areas that they figured out and stuff were just cut because there was a new skip found or whatever. And there's this moment of like, yes, we did it. And they're like fist pumping. And then a week later, you're like, damn, now I just lost like a lot of stuff that I love to do, actually. And that's kind of how I feel about the nonlinear structure of Dark Souls, where on one hand, it's really cool and fun as a player to route out, okay, where you're going to go, what's the most risky, what's the least risky, can we skip this, can we not skip this, and all right, how do I set up my upgrades here? Like, there's a fun routing style process to this, there's no doubt about it, and I personally did have a lot of fun figuring out my little routes and skips and stuff, very Super Metroid-like in that way. But if there's not a reason to go down into the basement, if there's not a reason to go to Blight Town, as a goal-oriented player, they just are gone. It's just bye-bye, you no longer exist. So that's why I always feel that in the end, this style of open-ended nonlinear structure will favor the more exploration-based players, the players who don't necessarily feel that impulse to make the game as efficient as possible, and instead are just perfectly valid and happy going down into the basement and fighting things down there just for like loot and little things like that. And the thing about the open nonlinear structure in the way that it relates to the RPG mechanics, we'll talk about the RPG mechanics here. In the initial stages of the game, it works well, like I said, on that fresh save file, because the RPG mechanics reinforce the combat, which reinforce the RPG mechanics, and you have that great building effect happening between the two. And as long as the game is constrained, and as long as things are kept at a small scale, this relationship works. And so that's why you'll see this in most action RPGs, not just Dark Souls, of course. But what ends up happening is that as the game scales and gets bigger and bigger and more open and open, the RPG mechanics are not connected to the levels anymore because the levels are open. They're non-linear. And so that whole trade-off of, okay, I'm going to venture off away from safety to fight some things, to get some XP, and that's really going to be meaningful for me in terms of the level design, that starts to fade because some areas will just dominate the other areas in terms of efficiency of farming, efficiency of collecting resources, and you don't get as much of this expansive relationship with the world as you would think. You end up creating a lot of disconnect between the game's level design and its systems because you can just warp away from wherever is inconvenient. And I think that is why that initial half of Dark Souls is a lot more beloved, and there is this recognition that the second half of the game falls short. It is that some of it is clearly unfinished, like the fire area, and the developers have said that. But it's more than that, because when the areas are unfinished, it's very easy to see these problems laid out in front of you. Like, let's take the fire area, because I think this is clearly the most unfinished area. There's a part in the fire area where you go down and you can see, all right, the correct path is on the right, and on the left, there's just this line of like dragon enemies over there. Why would I ever go over there? What's the point? And if it's, oh, I need XP or whatever, well, I could just go get XP somewhere else, warp instantly somewhere else, get the XP, come right back. The thing about not being able to warp is that you did have to at least deal with the moment-to-moment level design a lot more, just to at least avoid the tedium of having to run back and forth all the time, especially if you're trying to play for pace, trying to play for efficiency. You do start to route out, okay, I got to deal with these enemies here, deal with these enemies here, and then go through these paths here. But as soon as warping opens up, all of that is kind of out the window. And then it doesn't help that a lot of these second half areas of the game are just sort of flat. And that's really telling because it shows that your primary relationship in Dark Souls is not with the enemies, it's with the levels, it's with the layout of the world, the open world itself. And that is why I think Dark Souls was able to connect with a much wider audience, because it actually shares fundamentally a lot more DNA with something like The Legend of Zelda or classic Resident Evil than it necessarily does action games. Yeah, that's my thought on the open world nature of the game. It does primarily shift the way you interact with it. It's still really fun, but it's just a different relationship now. It's much more so based off of traversal and routing out and like this sort of macro scale, and the micro scale of dealing with encounters and dealing with like smaller rooms and stuff, that definitely fades off, especially in the second half of the game. And so in terms of combat, what does that leave us? The boss fights. Ah, yes, Souls boss fights, the candy of the series. One reason why I think boss fights in Dark Souls are so beloved is because the combat system itself is tailor-made for these types of encounters. It doesn't work nearly as well versus regular enemy encounters because, for one, if you get a group of multiple enemies together, that dynamic can actually be fun if you're forced to fight them at once, but because of the level design and usually because of the open space, it's much smarter and more reliable to separate them out, and the AI doesn't do a great job of sticking together. And so that is the modus operandi of dealing with groups of enemies, just isolate and kill. Then when it comes to the one-on-one encounters with humanoid enemies, on paper they are pretty fun, except both the parry and the backstab just obliterate these types of opponents, and they're so powerful that doing neutral hits seems unnecessarily risky. Maybe that's why they added Poise into the system, and we'll talk about Poise here in a bit, to try to give neutral hits more of a usage in these types of encounters. But nonetheless, if you just get down the parry timing or the backstab loop, you're golden, baby. But in boss fights, most of them you can't parry, some you can. So you finally get to return back to the fundamentals. And like I said in the intro, I think Dark Souls is always at its best when it's emphasizing the fundamentals, because that is the core of its design philosophy. And so with the overall approach to the boss design, I like it. I like the way Souls handles its bosses, and you can tell FromSoft really take a lot of pride in their boss design. I mean, aesthetically, unbelievable. I think in terms of aesthetics, Dark Souls bosses are amazing. I love the way these bosses look and their themes. The Four Kings is top tier aesthetically, but also like the giant wolf with a sword in its mouth. So in terms of the boss design itself, like the characters, the visuals, it's amazing, top tier. And I know that really wins a lot of people over and deserves the credit because, when I was fighting a wolf with a giant sword in its mouth, I'm like, FromSoft, this is really cool. That being said, one of the big issues with the bosses in Dark Souls is that once you learn how to play this game unlocked, the bosses are like helpless babies. They really struggle against this technique. And I think it's because they're primarily balanced around players using lock-on. I will say though, as easy as it is to abuse the hitboxes of the bosses in Dark Souls, I really appreciate that Dark Souls uses manual tracking and manual hitboxes. This is one of my favorite things overall about Dark Souls, and actually I think its greatest virtue is the fact that FromSoft are still OG and use manually designed hitboxes and manually designed interactions, because what's going on right now with action game design, especially among Western developers, is it turns out balancing encounters around manually moving enemies, swinging swords under your boss's legs and stuff, that's really hard to balance and to deal with. And so a lot of action games now are like, let's just automate the tracking. Let's just automate the spacing. Let's just make everything giant parryable things. So the fact that Dark Souls still uses these manual hitboxes with manually tracking moves, I am a huge fan of it and really credit FromSoft for sticking with this style of design. And what's funny is that you'll hear some critiques and players talking about how unfair the hitboxes in Dark Souls are, where sometimes a boss will have a hitbox on its foot, sometimes it won't have a hitbox on its foot. I actually feel very strongly that manual hitbox placement and placing where hitboxes are on a boss is fundamental to the identity of that boss and should not be so readily standardized. And that's a big thing I'm seeing now, and I really don't like it. The idea of like, well, this boss has hitboxes on his feet, so every boss ever should have hitboxes on their feet, or this boss has a hitbox on his elbow, the other boss doesn't have a hitbox on its elbow. I don't think so at all. I think one of the things that distinguishes one From Souls boss from another boss is where these manual hitboxes are, and the fact that you as the player kind of have to figure this out. You have to deal with unexpected hitboxes, because once you learn it, you're not going to get consistently surprised by it. And it's also a two-way street. Never forget that. As much as some of the bosses may abuse their hitboxes on you, it's actually much more likely for you to abuse your hitboxes on them. And I think it emphasizes all of the strengths of Dark Souls and Souls design. That manual tracking, the fact that having slopes makes a difference, the fact that the hitboxes need to interact manually. That is the magic sauce of this game's combat. Going back to the level design, slopes, hills, walls, all of that stuff really make a difference in Dark Souls, and I love how they incorporate this stuff into not only the level design, but also the boss encounters. I have a funny little example of this where I found some really powerful sword, and so I decided to use it on the big gray wolf fight, but it turned out that the swinging hitbox of this giant sword sweeps pretty low to the ground, and so I kept trying to hit the wolf with the damn thing, and its legs were too tall, so I was just whiffing. I need to find a sword with an upward swinging hitbox to hit his belly. And that's something I really appreciate about the weapon types of Dark Souls. It's not just about their stats and the poise and their damage and all that. It's also about the fundamentals of their startup, of their active frames, and of course the actual hitbox itself. And it makes a huge difference. It makes something like a short sword and a great sword be actually different weapons. So yeah, in terms of dealing with bosses and dealing with their attacks and dealing with trying to hit them, I love how everything is manual and takes place in real space, and you don't suck to target. You have to aim that. You have to move and aim. And that's a great trade-off for playing Unlocked, because the strength of playing Unlocked is that you just have amazing mobility, positioning. You can get yourself onto the sides of things really easily. You can get to exactly where you need to be quickly and effectively. But at least one trade-off of not being locked on is that it's harder to land your attacks. You got to aim those and if you miss, you're just whiffing, and that happens plenty. So I love the way the game makes its lock-on system actually a mechanic. So the core fundamentals are definitely there. The problem is just the dynamics. Once you learn the boss fights, once you learn, just stand to the side or stay to its right leg, or where you need to stand and what you need to react to, they end up kind of feeling a bit static in the end. And the fights that don't feel static, I think, are really interesting to point out. The ones that definitely stand out to me are the Four Kings and the double boss fight. So the Four Kings is probably my favorite of all the bosses in the game, because not only is the concept of you fighting in this black void amazing, that's such a cool idea, especially because it really screws around with your depth perception, and it feels kind of surreal and weird as you're trying to move towards them and they're moving towards you. I love the concept, and I also love that it is a multi-boss fight. The thing about it is that there is a technique that works pretty well, which is if you're standing next to a king, the other kings will not approach as much. The exact enemy behavior I'm not fully tuned into, but basically, if you're close to a king, it's like being safe in tag. Unless they're already close to it, then they'll start swinging at you. So basically, if you get one by itself and stand next to it, you should be mostly okay, other than if they fire ranged attacks. And then if they get grouped up, you have to run away and separate them out again. And I know the concept is you're supposed to be speed killing them before the next guy spawns, so you don't have to deal with multiple kings at once, but dealing with more than one is really fun. And I love how dynamic they are, where they have different styles of strings that are kind of tricky to read, and then they have that explosive get off me attack that you have to run away from, so that puts you in danger, and then the grabbing lunge that you have to roll behind. They just have a great X factor to them, where even if you know what you're doing, even if you know the strategy you're going for, you're still nervous. Things can overlap and get crazy. So that was a real highlight for me. And then the double boss fight, that one is also really fun. What I've observed so far playing both Demon's Souls and Dark Souls is that double boss fights in these games stand out because they add that extra dynamic element of you can't just learn and memorize the strings and the behavior, because you have to deal with overlapping behavior. So it creates a more varied dynamic while also not being too RNG, too random, too crazy. I guess we can just transition into Bed of Chaos, because I forgot to mention that earlier. So, Bed of Chaos, the most infamous boss of Dark Souls. Coming into it, I thought this thing was going to be just insane by its reputation of being like this troll-ass boss. I thought it was going to be a nightmare. I kind of get what they were going for with this thing. Basically, I think the idea was they wanted a chaotic, dynamic boss fight, obviously in the name, where you're more worried about getting pushed off an edge than you are trying to dodge regular styles of attacks. And I think it's great that they're trying to add a little bit more variety to what the bosses do and behave like. The only issue with Bed of Chaos is it's just too random. I think they overtuned the randomness too much. And what ends up happening is that, I've talked about this in arcade design, you need to find that perfect blend of RNG where you have to react to it, you have to stay dynamic with it, but it's still reasonable enough to try to deal with. That's like a double boss fight, or the Four Kings, that's like the correct amount of variance. Whereas with the Bed of Chaos, because it's just so chaotic, what you do is you say, all right, forget this, let's find a workaround. Throwing bombs or shooting it with arrows. I don't use ranged weapons in my playthroughs. That's my one little arbitrary challenge I make for myself. So I just abused Poise. I put on just the heaviest ass armor ever and a double-handed shield, and I just used Poise to just tank through the attacks. And as I'm doing that, I'm like, is this what you want me to do? Is that what this bed of chaos is? Please don't tell me this is just a Poise check. I know Miyazaki himself has kind of said this was a mistake. We don't really think this was a great idea. But you don't need Miyazaki to tell you that to get this feeling, because the Bed of Chaos is the only boss fight where damage done to it is permanent. So that shows they were not super confident with this design. They're like, well, we don't want to undo players' progress in this boss fight. Imagine that with other boss fights. You go back and like the damage is still there. So I think that just shows they were insecure about it. They weren't really that confident about its design, and look how it is received. So the final boss is a humanoid Parry fight, because it turns out that if you just put on heavy armor and use Poise, you can tank the first hit of his attack and then very reliably just anticipate the second hit, because it's a sequence, right? And so the way it works, I'll teach you how to beat the boss really easily, is on the big windups, you can just react to those as they're happening, parry that. And then on his very quick slash, which I think is meant to be an anti-parry tech, which is a great idea. Ninja Gaiden does something similar as well, where if you're trying to just run up and parry ninjas and stuff, they'll just do this really fast grab that's really hard to react to. So that disincentivizes you from just standing in front of them waiting to parry them. So in concept, it's there, right? He's got an anti-parry attack there because it's so fast and unreactable, except Poise. Because Poise, you can just tank it and then be like, Estus, and then parry his next follow-up. So that is why I really do not like the Poise system of Dark Souls. At first, I was a little bit more like, let's see where this goes, because when it comes to using Poise against regular enemies, I could see an idea behind that, which is, remember before about how good parries and backstabs are against regular enemies? So I could see FromSoft themselves sitting down and saying, all right, we want natural hits to have some sort of reason to exist, right? I think they could have increased the hits done, which they did do. There's nice hits done in Dark Souls. I appreciate that. And the Poise could kind of add to that. I could see where it comes from. I can see the concept in terms of the way it interacts with enemies. However, when it comes to you having Poise, that's the problem, because now this is affecting the melee combat of the game in a way that I think undermines the fundamentals. And that's what I say is the strengths of Dark Souls' whole combat system. That's what makes it good. What makes Dark Souls combat work is how fundamental it is. It's cutting through the fat, the bullshit, and just getting down to hitboxes, startup, manual tracking, manual aiming, hit stun, all of the fundamentals. And in Demon Souls, that was pretty much how it was. Dark Souls, now you've got some RPG mechanics. You got the Poise. So now, when you go back through early areas of the game, you can just steamroll through them like a tank. And I think that is another issue with maybe even the Capper Demon boss fight, where, again, it's a cool concept having to fight the dogs and dealing with these active threats. My first playthrough, I had to come up with all of these strategies to separate out the dogs and protect myself. And I was like, whoa, this is a real fight, Dark Souls. But again, was that just a Poise check? Because if someone was playing and they're like really asking me, okay, how do I get through this fight super reliably? Just throw on some armor. You'll tank through the dogs. Their hit stun means nothing. And just focus on moving out of the way of the demon's swings. So I just do not think this Poise system, in terms of the way it buffs heavy armor in the player, is a good addition to the melee combat, because it just undermines the fundamentals way too much. It's fun at first, I will say, to just tank through things and be like a berserk god and kill everything. But then it feels like you're playing a Muso rather than playing Souls, right? If you can just blast your way through everything. And then, Estus is so generous, and the health of this game is so generous that tanking hits isn't even that big of a deal anyway. You just slurp, 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 and boom, you're fine. And since the game is so generous with the amount of Estus you get, because at any bonfire you can kindle and get 10, and then if you upgrade that 10 to like even +3, I mean, you are dealing with a lot of health, a lot. I think capping the Estus is a great idea. It cuts down on farming, and I'm sure that was the goal, but 10 is a lot. That's really forgiving. And then what ends up happening, at least for me, is I never felt like I truly learned the boss fights fully because I never needed to really learn them because I always could fall back on just drinking Estus. And there's not a punishment for doing that because the boss fight's over, you just refill it. Boom. No problem whatsoever. And so I think if they had kept the cap at 5 throughout the entire game, you just get 5, I think that would have brought the difficulty more into focus and brought the design of the game more into focus, because if the player can just fall back on resources, then they never fully engage with the systems of the game. And obviously you want some forgiveness, but 10 is too much, and it's not like you ever run out of humanities to kindle bonfires. And so overall, I think the boss fights and the Estus system, they're great concepts, but I think they're too
lenient.
And part of that is probably because this is Dark Souls before it became this big phenomenon and had this huge player base and had this reputation for being like, oh, the difficult, high skill game. And so I could see them with Dark Souls 1 after Demon Souls trying to be more approachable. So I think they're overly generous in Dark Souls 1. They're overly kind, which is funny because it has such a reputation for being difficult. And I thought we should end the review by speaking about the Dark Souls difficulty a little bit. We all know that Dark Souls has an oversized reputation for difficulty, probably because it's the only real game most game journalists have played. I'm not going to hold that against it. I can only aspire to be a victim of my own success someday. So I think it's much more worthwhile to describe Dark Souls' difficulty because I think that helps us understand what's going on. And I would say that the difficulty of Dark Souls is front-loaded difficulty, meaning that most of your trial and error and failure is going to happen in your initial playthrough as you're getting to learn the game and its layout and the patterns and everything. And so that is why my first playthrough is 20 hours and why when you first start off, you kind of have a long playthrough with lots of deaths. That's because there's a lot of trial and error. And I think this is absolutely a valid form of game design. And it is one of my favorite things about Dark Souls is the fact that Dark Souls, unlike pretty much every other AAA game out there, is perfectly fine forcing the player to learn from failure. It is not failure adverse like every single other game out there where it's a crime against humanity if you game over or die in most other AAA games. And so Dark Souls, just by force breaking that perception, I think is really important just in terms of the overall health of game design for doing that. And so it gets absolute kudos in my book. My favorite example of this is, of course, in Sense Fortress. The first time you open the freaking chest and it eats you. I really like stuff like that. I like FromSoft sending the player a message of like, hey, death is part of the process. I talked about this in Demon Souls. So I like that Dark Souls does not back off on that aspect of its design. It's really important. But the problem with Dark Souls difficulty, and I think it stands out more in Dark Souls than in Demon Souls, is because Dark Souls is a bigger game. The scale is much larger, is that it has a lot of that front-loaded difficulty, but it has very little systematic difficulty. Systematic difficulty is all the stuff that happens after you've learned the game. So once you know, okay, this is the map layout, this is where the enemies are, this is what their weaknesses are, this is where I go, this is what you do on the boss, you've learned the game. You know it by heart, you can understand what to do. At that point, Dark Souls itself has very little resistance against you. Its system is crazy forgiving. It's really funny because, like I said, it has this reputation because that front loading of difficulty is so stark, especially because there's so much of it in Dark Souls because the game's so big. So it feels like there's a lot. But once you get through it and you've learned it all, you realize, wow, Dark Souls is a very chill game. For example, in Demon Souls, the soul system, after you died, you would respawn and you'd have half a health bar. That's systematic difficulty. It's a punishment for dying. In Dark Souls, yes, you die a lot, but the deaths are kind of a slap on the wrist. Nothing really happens to you. Yeah, if you have a humanity, you'll lose that, but you quickly learn, unless you're going for some sort of item farming technique or something, you don't really need to be in human form. The only thing you're missing out on is item pickups, but if you have your items routed already, like I do, that only comes up occasionally, right? And so you mostly just have your humanities banked up as hard assets. And when you die, they're perfectly safe and fine. So you're not losing humanities. And then even with the XP stuff, again, in that first playthrough where you don't know what's around the corner, you don't know where the bonfires are, this whole XP loss and then having to go retrieve your bloodstain, that seems like, oh, that's some systematic difficulty there. Except with the bonfire system, especially because there's a lot more of them than the checkpoints in Demon's Souls, you can pretty quickly cash out any liquid assets reliably. And so as I'm routing through Dark Souls, for example, I hardly ever have liquid assets just sitting in my souls bank there. And if I do, they're enough to be to where I don't level up. And if there's something I need to save souls up for, like buying the crest to open the forest, I just keep those as hard assets so I don't cash them out. So once you learn this meta of saving hard asset souls and then just using your liquid assets to level up, dying, losing the souls is kind of pointless, meaningless, doesn't really affect you. And then humanities thing, that doesn't affect you. And it goes back to the fact that at the end of the day, why most games are compared to Dark Souls these days, why Dark Souls is the modern game that everything is compared to. It's informal, like I said, it blends many genres, like I said, and then the final missing piece is that it is progression-based. And what's interesting in a progression-based system is that the only true punishment is tedium, is making you waste time, like resource farming. That's the only way this style of system can punish you in a true sense. They're not gonna be ballsy enough to make you have to reset your entire save file and have a true permadeath system. Instead, you can only lose small slices of progress at a time, and then once you make it to that bonfire or save point, that progress is now forever protected. And also notice how close together the bonfires are. Imagine if they made Dark Souls, but the Firelink Shrine was the only bonfire, or there were only a few bonfires in the entire world. The size and balance of the game would take on an entirely different significance. And that's why the key hallmark of classic-based games is permadeath. I talked about this in my permadeath video, which I think ties in really well with this Souls video, by the way. So Dark Souls, at the end of the day, as Notori said it is, that you die a lot in the game, and you will because you're learning it, deaths are pretty chill. It's not really that big of a deal. I guess when you're an immortal soul, dying is just you're part of everyday life. Like, go shopping, die, respawn, not a problem. And actually, I think that is why Souls really lends itself to challenge runs and speed running and all of these like meta elements of playing it, because it's got this great system, it's got this great framework, but because of its informal nature and because of its like really chill treatment of death and stuff, you always find yourself wanting to do more in the game. Like, please, Dark Souls, let me do more. It doesn't have that systematic difficulty. That's why once you learn to beat the game, yeah, beat it with a trumpet. You beat it with a DDR dance pad. And so my final thoughts on Dark Souls is that I really enjoyed this game. I don't think it's as nearly insane as hardcore as its reputation, but at the same time, I find the Souls series to be this very nice midpoint, this third space between more difficult hardcore games and more accessible casual games. And it brings both groups together. And that's just very unique and valuable, and something that I very much look forward to while doing these reviews. It's really refreshing, I have to say, after playing like some modern AAA games and then you just fire up Dark Souls. This game's integrity and craftsmanship and aesthetics just really stand out as fantastic. And so Even though I don't think it's perfect, I think it sets a really strong, great template that's still retaining the roots of what Demon Souls sets up. It makes me a little sad that we won't get, like, from what I'm aware of, a follow-up to Demon Souls style of design, but it's still preserved inside Dark Souls to a large degree, and so I appreciate that. And I can really see how Dark Souls became the template for such a massive franchise, not only in its own right, but also has heavily influenced other franchises and pretty much all mainstream AAA games now, and even just gaming outside of the big space. Indie games are heavily influenced by Souls. It's just obviously one of the most important, influential releases, probably since it came out. And I can see what its main strength is, if I boil it all down, is it's this midpoint, this third space that just blends together lots of different styles of games and ideas and concepts and sets up a new template for where they can interact and work. Now, does it at the very top end hold together as like the most hardcore, skill-based, challenging game ever? No, it doesn't. So yeah, if you enjoyed this review, definitely check out my review of Demon Souls and Demon Souls Remake, and also keep an eye out for my next review in the Souls series, Dark Souls 2. Also check out why permadeath matters, because that's really relevant to Dark Souls. So thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe, tell all your friends, and if you can, support me on Patreon. I'm a full-time YouTuber, and the patrons are what makes this channel happen, and there's lots of cool exclusive Patreon content now, and I'd really appreciate that a lot. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons: 100, Absconditis, Eternal Solitude, Anhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Aldrin, Alex, Alexander Pfeiffer, AMH, Anthony A, Arping Gordon, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Li, Autonamed, Baron Metziger Stein, Battle Mode, Basil Me Dazzle, Bellator Poeta, Ben Foster, Benjamin Shabalski, Vito Dames, Bog Hog, Borgie22, Brokeface, Brindle Swiftfoam, Bruh, Captain Rhodes, Catchright Studio, Chop, Shapelip, Kristen SoCal, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Cipolino 0404, Clara Cliff, Clarity, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Concreted, Cooksan 666, Cooks and Soup, Corio, Corn Hoglin, Cozy, Crew Expendable, CSP 3900, Kudo, CRZ, Des Audio, DRK, Damian Thorne, Dat Matei, Dan Chi, Darren Griffin, Dat Guy, David Aldris, David Crespo, Dididum, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Diodomke, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Duckies, Easter Egg, Eduardo Aquinta, Edvard, Elvin Senisev, Elias Alonso, Epson Eagle, Eric Shrivner, Eric Houdini, Esteban Bazama, Eulogy 16, Evan Seifert, Explosive General Games, Fabio Pinchi, Falcus, Fenich Mathai, Perez, Fiskin, Five Side, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Gabriel Foreigner, Game Soup, Gameboy Grew, Gelhoff, Gettershine, Gojira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk, Hans Kowalski, HDZ 274, Hero Death, Hanharthi, HUD, Humongous, Iran DMS, Italo Inferno, JDab, Jake Ryan, Jurgen, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, Jay McCarthy, J67, JLab, JBRPG, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, JMD, JOH, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Slaylise, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Josh Mayer, Josie, JT, Julian Elwood, Josie, JT, Julian Elwood, K, K2, Kane Evans, Keotune, Ken 10082, Kill Music, Kinstaro, Contain, Crazed the Boys, Kuma Wamu, Kyarts, Kyrol, Leonard McCoy, Malberta, Lobos, Lula Lalich, LZR Cuter, Macabre Monster, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Mario Simic, Markman, Mason Polar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Matau Batau, Maze, Mekaroka, Minong, Meister, Men's Rhea, Metal Slime Drummer, Michael Del Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Mig ZDM, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morog, Munro, Munsta Zero, Miles P, Mishkin, Naps91, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Nervous J, Nilheim, Neo04, Nogden, Okla Kugels, Oleg Tolmasev, Panzer Dragoon should have been arcade, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Pedro Montoya, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, Pizza Belly, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Quilon Yeager, R2 Sinus, Raccoons, Rafael Trujillo, Randoom, Randy Leahy, Raul VP, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Rent Halt's Time, Repo Man, Retro Schmupper, Riff Mason, Robert Chang, Rope Hollander, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Running Aku, Salmon Connections, San Nevo, Sarn, Scanline City, Seymour, Segfault, Serial EXP Greg, Shader Bunny, Shazzy, Shift Delete, Shih Tzu Supreme, Shinjutsu 1600, Shmup Junkie, True, Simply Chrono, Surapong, Snowcrab, Social Kid, Sophisticated, Space, Spake Ward, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synthmilk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, Ted Ray 77, Thana Oat, The Dirty Screech, The Couchu, The N1, The Old Bensta, The Smartest Billy, Tom McCarthy, Tim French, T Money, Tofu Man, Tom Faze, Travis Arbon, Tristan, Sugumo, Turam, 2YU, Twest Please, Tyler Olu, Typo Air, Urokeeper, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vandal, Velenex, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vlad STG, Wabby Legs, What Is This? William Miller, William Wallace, Yellow Tello, Your Nerdy Joe, Yeespurd, Zachary Patton, Zach, Zeal, Zenryoku, Zingus, Zerolux.